And I'm going to start sharing my slides for today. So we're today at the External Resources session, first day of April, and then we have just 2 sessions left after this, the dedupe and Ferber and the Primo Analytics session, and then we'll be all set for this series. So today we're talking about loading external data sources into Primo V. And today we'll start by looking at the differences between the internal and external resources that you might be loading into Primo V and Alma, just kind of clarifying what we're talking about when we're talking about loading external resources. We'll also take a look at which data formats are currently supported and cover the sort of concept of loading and viewing external data in Primo V, and then we'll go through an overview of the process. We'll also take a closer look at each of the steps, including defining the normalization rule, testing it, and then creating the import profile, see a demo of the sort of whole start to finish process. And then we'll also take a look at how to delete external resources, external data sources, which is fortunately a pretty easy process if you need to do that as well. So starting with the overview. So obviously we know about our library collections, but just to sort of compare and contrast the internal records with the external resources so we understand how they differ. So your library collections are your records that are loaded into Alma during data migration, implementation, your ongoing cataloging, your original cataloging, import profiles, all of that, getting your local records into Alma. They could also include Alma D. So if you have Alma Digital, you could be managing your digital records internally in Alma and can make edits and, edit them inside of Alma, basically. And all of these record types are stored, managed, maintained, editable inside of the Alma interface. They go directly into Primo and they're indexed and displayed within 15 minutes. This is obviously things we already know, but just comparing them with the external resources, these are from sources that are not currently loaded into Alma, so they wouldn't have been part of your migration project. They might have been loaded as part of your Primo V setup, but they're digital repositories where the resource is stored outside of Alma, outside of Primo V. It could be libguides, it could be other digital repositories, content DM, DSpace repositories, where the records are managed and maintained in the source system. So you wouldn't be managing them inside of Alma, but you could use this process to load the records into Primo V for discovery using the discovery import profile. So again, the original records are not managed or maintained in Alma, but you are creating infrastructure in Alma to explain to Alma and Primo V how we're going to import these records, how we're going to map them, how they're going to be displayed. But after you load your records with the import profile, if you're loading external resources, they will get an MMS ID, as we'll see when we go through the load, but that MMS ID doesn't correspond to any record in Alma. So it's not actually bringing anything up because we're not storing anything, any of these external resources actually inside of Alma. They're being stored still, they live still in their external repository, but we're just using this as an interface to get them into Primo V so that they can be displayed easily with the rest of your records. The records are mapped into double core for Alma to process, and we'll see that there's a lot of standard mapping already in place, and then some ways to map local data that you might have. And then again, these records are indexed and displayed within 15 minutes after you run whatever kind of import profile that you end up defining, and we'll take a look at that. So there are 2 types of data formats that are supported. The first is Dublin Core, and just from like personal anecdotal experience, that seems to be what most people have, Dublin Core records. And these are loaded and stored into Alma in a proprietary format, but the existing 55 or so standard Dublin Core fields are already mapped And we'll see as we go through the creation of the import profile that there's not a ton of work you need to do to map. Um, but there are local fields. So if you do have local fields that aren't standard and you want to map them to a local field so that, they end up displaying in your record, and you're defining actually what they are, you have 50 local fields that you can use, Discovery Local 01 to Discovery Local 50. And I think that's still accurate. I should check. I know some of these things have been upped to 100, but at least it used to be you had 50 local fields that you could play with, and then you would map them like you would map local fields in that area, the manage local fields area of the config. You could map those so that they could be imported so that Alma knows what to do with them. If you do have non-standard fields in Dublin Core and you don't go through the mapping process to map them to a discovery local field, they would get ignored just because Alma doesn't know what to do with them. If they're not part of the standard mapping and you've not mapped them to a local field, they'll just be skipped. Um, there's also a way to map the discovery resource type, because a lot of the type will come in the Dublin Core record in the DC:type field, and it might contain resource types that are more specific than the ones that are allowable in Primo V. So, for example, you might have a DC type where the material type is poster or something like that in your Dublin Core record, in your source record, but that's not an allowable resource type in Primo V, not a standard resource type. So there are ways that you can map the resource type coming from your source record into an allowable type in Primo V, like image, so that you can have retain the image resource type, rather than having it load as other, which is what it will load as if it can't make a map. So we'll take a look at two different ways to do that mapping. You can also use generic XML. It's more work to configure because you need to do that mapping to map the XML fields to the standard Dublin Core local fields. Or I'm sorry, the standard Dublin Core fields. And it may also require mapping to discovery local fields as well. And then you would need to identify the tags that indicate the beginning and ending of the records, so that Alma is able to parse it as the record is imported in. We're not going to go through the generic XML process today. We're going to look at Dublin Core, but it is an option to use XML. So let's take a look at the sort of overview of the steps that you need to do to load external records into Primo V. So first, we would generally define the normalization rules. Um, I'll show you why you might want to use normalization rules. You don't have to use normalization rules. A lot of stuff is mapped by default. And if you are okay with, some of the resource types potentially going into other, or maybe you have really standard Dublin Core records and you don't need to use normalization rules in this case, but we'll go through that process. There's also a mapping table that in some cases can be used in place of normalization rules if we're just talking about resource types. But if you did define normalization rules, you would need to test them on a test record or a test set of records. And then you would define a normalization process task, which would allow the task to be used in the import profile. And it's very similar if you've created normalization process tasks for other parts of Alma to get, make data changes to Alma records. It's a very similar process. And then you would configure your discovery import profile to load your records into Alma to get them into Primo V. And then you would run it. And then I'll show how you can test viewing those records in Primo V, and how you might want to scope them. Okay, so starting with defining the normalization rules. Apparently I've been logged out. Let me log back in. Into Primo as well, just in preparation. So we'll watch Alma think for a second. Okay. So we're going to go into the config menu and we're going to be in discovery config. And everything we need for today is under the Loading External Data Sources menu. So we're going to start with the normalization rules. So clicking on this is going to bring me into the metadata editor because that's where we define our norm rules. And up here, I'm going to select rules. That's what we're going to work on. Oh, and see, this is pre-filtered, but you can use this drop down here to choose normalization DC rules. So, that will pare down significantly the amount of rules that are coming back from the community, especially, which can take a long time to load. And then if you have any that are already in your own private folder or in your institution's shared folder, you can work directly with the DC rules. But you can also select normalization XML rules also. If you were using XML. So let's look at the community rules. So there aren't so many DC rules in the community zone, but you can take a look at them, see what other people have done. We're going to take a look at this EXL rule here, map DC type to discovery resource type, because we know that we have the choice to map local fields, which is one option, mapping our local Dublin core fields to local fields in Primo V so that they're available for discovery. And then the other option we have is to map our DC type, which might be different from the allowable types in Primo V, into discovery resource types. In this particular rule, this map DC type to discovery resource type rule that is available in the community zone is a normalization rule that has what I think are a lot of common DC types like research paper. Then we're using the articles resource type in Primo V, discovery resource type. So it's just making maps between what you might have in your DC type, so like book chapters, then we're going to use books in Primo V. So you can go through this and see if this matches what you want to map, and you can make adjustments to the rule. And in the documentation, there's the supported resource types in Primo V. So you can take a look at the code and then the display name for the types that you actually have to choose from. So you can use that to map what might be coming from your Dublin core record. And you can use this, obviously, this is a really good template to use. You can just remove the rules that don't apply to you and edit the ones that you want to make changes to if you have, other thoughts on how this mapping should go. Um, but this is a community zone rule. So if you wanted to use it, you would end up duplicating it to put it into your institution's shared folder. And then from there, you could edit it as need be. So I already have a copy of it here. And then I can make any edits I needed to the normalization. And when I thought I was done editing the rule, I have this save and test using external record down here, which is really useful. It automatically brings you into the next step of the process. So when I hit this, I'm saving any changes I've made to my rule, and then it automatically brings me to the testing normalization of non-Alma Primo V records. So now I can test my normalization rule before I apply it in any way. So selecting record type, I have Dublin Core, generic XML, or Mark 21. We're using Dublin Core. And then you can test the normalization rule. So this would be like one rule or a process. If you've defined a process already, you can use that on a set if you wanted to see that. In this case, I'm going to just browse for a single record. I have one record here. And so I just browse for it and then I can upload it. And then once I upload it, the source record is put immediately onto the left side, and you can take a look at the Dublin core that's loaded in. And then this particular rule, our normalization rule, is taking DC type and it's mapping it to allowable resource types in Primo V. So we see the DC type incoming is research paper. So I've loaded my record. I'm choosing my normalization rule. There's actually two that are the same, but and then I'm running the test. And then on the right side, it will show my normalized Dublin core record, and it will show me my discovery resource type, which is the field that's added. So it's added this and it's mapped it to articles. So articles will be the resource type that displays in Primo V when this is loaded.
Laura, we have a question about how to get to this page, this configuration, or this testing page
Sure.
utility.
So the way that I got to it was I was in the normalization rule area, and then I clicked save and test record, but you can also get to it here in your discovery config under loading external data sources. There's also test normalization rules. So you can get to it here also if you wanted to test them here. So kind of two ways to get into it. But if you're in the rule area and then you click save and test, then it saves you, I guess, a click to get here. So that's how I ended up opening this. Um, and then with my normalized record on the right side. So, and then the nice thing about this is that it's retained the DC type. So you still have that. It's not like it's made any edits to, removing this or whatever. And then you've added your discovery resource type so that now PrimoV knows what resource type this is. So this has actually worked the way we expect. So then you'd want to do testing, maybe have to go back to the rule if it didn't work as expected. But once you have your rule acting the way you want to, then you can add it to a normalization process task, which would be the next step. I want to pause here though and go back into the menu and go to the last piece in this menu, the double core type to discovery type mapping table. So you can use the normalization rules to map the resource type like we just saw. But there's also a table that you can use. And then this is the DC source. So, for example, if we have DC type poster, we can map that to discovery type of images in Primo V. So you can use this table if you don't necessarily want to use the normalization rules. And if the normalization rules are only dealing with resource type, then you can basically use this table instead. But of course, your normalization rules might also be doing other things with your data in terms of manipulating the data while you're importing it. So you have the choice sort of two different ways to do it. So you have your mapping table where you can just map the incoming type to the discovery type, or you can use the normalization as we saw with the creating the normalization rules. So the next step, if we were going to go ahead and continue on with the normalization rule that we saw, is to add it to a normalization process task. So this is similar to other normalization process tasks. If you've worked with them in Alma, normalizing data, it's pretty similar. There's less options though, because this is the Discovery Bib Records business entity, so it automatically filters to that for you to make it easier for you to create the profile. So if I add profile, it's already selected this business entity of Discovery Bib Records, and that's what we want for this load, creating these for Discovery in Alma Primo V. And we have two types of normalization processes we can select. One is for the generic XML load, and the other is for the DC normalization load. And we're using double core, so that's what we're going to choose. And then I need to give it a name and a description. And then, I'm going to keep active. And then you have in the third option, you have add tasks. Click on add tasks. And there's actually only one, so that makes it easy. It's the DC Drool normalization, which is the language that you write the normalization rule in. So you can select add and close, and that's all for this screen. And then you go to the next screen and then you choose the key. So the Drools file key is just the name of the rule that you defined in the metadata editor. So the one that I was looking at was this copy of EXL. So that's the name of it. So that's the one I choose. So it's adding this rule to the process. Click save, and then we have the normalization process task defined. Um, so let's see. Just look at my notes, make sure I'm not skipping anything. Okay. So the next step is to actually define the import profile. So we're going to the loading external data sources, and we're going to discovery import profiles, and I'm going to add a new profile. And it automatically selects discovery for me, so that's right, used for loading external records from external systems for discovery and Primo V. So we'll go on to next. And then I'll give the profile a name and maybe a description. And then I have to define a data source code. So it will need to be a unique code that defines the source, whatever repository, a descriptive code for the repository that you're getting the records from. And then the label, this will appear in the detail section of the record that you load in Primo V, and you can translate it. But this is visible to your user, so you'll want to select something that makes sense in terms of where the record is coming from. And then you have originating system here. So if you were loading like libguides or something like that, you would be using other. But if you're using dspace, I'm sorry, I just like I just kicked the power cord for my computer. One second. Okay. One sec. I'm just gonna reset my laptop on the docking station. Okay, let me stop sharing for 1 second. I'm sorry about that. I just absolutely kicked it. Um, Oops. Just gonna move everything back to my second monitor, and then I'll continue sharing. Okay. Okay, we're back. Um, so originating system, right, you'd be choosing other if you had other, and then you have dspace if you had dspace and content DM. So you would just choose the originating system. I have a dspace record, so that's what I'll choose here. And then for import protocol, the way I'll be doing it in demo is upload file. So I'm basically browsing to a file on my computer that contains the DC records, or if I was using XML, the XML records. But likely you'll be using either FTP or OAI harvesting. So if you're using FTP, you'll see additional options appear down here. So you have your scheduling. So this is really useful. You can have the job go out, the import profile check on some schedule in the folder that you've defined on the FTP or SFTP server to try and find those records and, consistently import them. So that can be a way to manage it. And then if you use the FTP, of course, you would define either the connection type. So this would be something that you've previously defined in Alma, an SFTP server that's already configured, or you can add a new one and then, fill in everything that you need to do here to use a different one. And then the input directory where Alma would go to find the file. And then you also might be using the file name patterns if you're using the FTP option. And if you hover over the little info thing, let me move the chat over. But if you hover over this informational thing, it will help you. You can define file name patterns that you want it to look for and ignore other ones in case the FTP directory that you define has multiple types of files in it to make sure that it's importing the ones that you expect. If you use OAI as your import protocol, again, you'll see the scheduler, so you can, decide to schedule it during some regular interval if you wanted to. And then you have your OAI base URL. And so you would need to enter that, and then you would hit connect and edit. And then it would give you, it would auto-populate other fields like the harvest date. And you could test a record from there to make sure that, you were getting, you were actually connecting to the source system. And if you were using that, that's how you would set that up. And the documentation goes through all of the different options that appear if you have an OAI base URL and you select that there. But in this case, it's much more simple So all of my options below go away when I click on upload file because I'm just browsing for a particular file. And then I have my physical source format. You have XML, which is probably what you'll be using, or binary there. And then the source format, double core, your generic XML, Mark 21 bibliographic. We're choosing Dublin Core in this case. And then the target format, you can't edit, but the target format I think is always Dublin Core in this case. Um, but in any case, that is also expected. And then, of course, we'll leave it as active, so that's good. So we'll go to the next step. And then here's your normalization process. You can select the process task that you defined previously. So we created this normalized DC process task. So we could select that here. So that's going to do the thing where it's checking the resource type and then assigning the Primo V resource type as it's being loaded. You don't have to use any normalization rule. So if you don't have any that you've defined, you can, just leave this blank and continue forward. But we'll select our normalization rule. And then here we have our loading of DC records screen. So let me find, I have a slide to kind of describe the use case where you might use some of the different options here. So let me find that. Okay. So you have the options to use either a static link or a template. And what is the use case for using this, either for linking or for thumbnail or for link to request? So the reason you might use the static link is if you see the box here, in this case, there's 3 DC identifiers. One has the URL to the resource, so that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to create the link in Primo V so that when they click on link to resource, they'll actually get to our external repository, to the correct record. So that's what we're aiming for. But we also have a DC identifier that has an OCN number and a DC identifier that has some other, unique identifier for this record. So if we only had, in this scenario, say we only had this top DC identifier. There was only one DC identifier in the record. It had the URL, and you knew that it was consistent across all of the Dublin Core records. So all of your records in your external repository have one DC identifier, and that DC identifier contains the URL. In that scenario, you could use this static link, and you could say, okay, we're always going to look at DC identifier, and it's always going to have the URL, and that's what we're using to create the link. What's probably more common is this scenario where you have multiple DC identifiers, and you're going to need, in this case, to use the template option because we're going to say, okay, we're going to look at DC identifier, but there might be more than one. And so we're always going to be looking for the one that has the URL. And so we'll see how to do that. But that's kind of the use case. Why would you use one or the other? Yeah. I would say that that's the use case there. And so if you had the static URL from source, it's pretty easy. You just select the Dublin Core tag that's going to have the URL in it. And then you could put the link label, which is displaying to your users, and you can translate it if necessary there. And then you have the same for the link to thumbnail and the link to request. So you can do the same thing. So you can have your static URL and then choose, the field that way. If you're using the template option, which I'm going to do because I know that I'm going to have multiple DC identifiers and I need to make sure that I'm choosing the right one. Under the template, I'm going to choose the parameter that I'm going to use, the linking parameter that I'm going to define. And it looks like this, $, and then linking parameter 1. And the linking parameter 1 corresponds to down here on the linking parameters table, this one, linking parameter 1. And the linking parameter 1 is going to contain the instruction to where I can find the link. So I'm going to say I'm using a template in this case. Look at the variable linking parameter 1. Here is my link label. I'm not going to define a thumbnail or a link to request because I don't have that. But I'm going to go down to my linking parameters table, and I'm going to edit it. So here is where I choose the source tag from the Dublin core. So we're still looking in DC identifier. We're just not sure which DC identifier is going to contain um, is going to contain the URL. So it's not a URI, ISBN, ISSN, ISMN. I don't know what that is, but I'm going to select just this generic DC identifier. And what's weird about this screen is that it's like compressed and you can't see the source tag. And I don't really know why that is, but if you hover over it, it will show the one that you've defined. So it's just kind of like a weird display thing. But you can go in again and make sure that you've selected the right one, and you can hover over and make sure that DC terms identifier, that's what we're going to use. And then for use source tag, always would mean we're not entering any matching parameter. We're always using the source tag, which is basically the same as using the static link option. But in this case, we're going to use, you can either have a matching string or a matching string using a regular expression. And I'm going to use matching string using a regular expression because it's a little bit more flexible. And this language, this regex that's looking for the HTTPS:// this is in the documentation, so you don't have to know how to write this regex to use it. You can just copy it from the doc and use it because I think it's probably what most people use for this, matching the string. But this is more flexible because it's HTTP or HTTPS. So if I use just matching string, I would have to write like HTTP://. And then if I had one that had the secure, then I wouldn't be matching that string. So in this case, this is better for me. And then are you normalizing the source tag using a regular expression? In this case, we're not. We're just using this for matching. So I'm just trying to match the regular expression with the string. So I can save. And then that's it. So I see that my source tag, my DC identifier is linked here. The linking parameter has been edited. We're using that as the template. So we're good to go. We can save it. So now my profile is here in the import profiles area. And it's already pre-filtered to discovery. So we're just seeing these two. And then from here, I can actually run it. So I can go to the row action and I can go to run. And then I get the file browser because I chose when I was creating this profile, I chose that I was going to upload file. If you were using like an OAI harvesting or the FTP option, it would just go to the FTP or it would use the information for the OAI to do the harvest. You wouldn't need to do anything. But in this case, I need to browse because that's the option that I chose. So I think that's the one that I want to use. And this is just one single record. So we're hoping that it will load pretty quickly. And I'm just going to submit the job here. And so it was submitted successfully, so that's good. It also does some parsing before it tries to import it, so you would know if you had something incorrect in the format before you started. It wouldn't let you import. And then it's completed successfully, so that's obviously good news. And I can look at the report here. So the report table is going to show your new records added, updated, whatever, deleted. And so we have our new records added, and I can go to the row action in the report table, and I could go to preview records. And then if you wanted to take the MMS ID, so you can just copy it, and then I'm going to search in my everything scope for it. And so we do see that this is the one record that was contained in my file. I've mapped it to, here, let me just open it, to the image resource type. So you can take a look at it. So, I mean, this probably isn't an image. I was just kind of manipulating the file to see what I could get to display in Primo V. So it's mapped to Primo V resource type, so that's good. It's available online. And I've seen this. I don't know why it's not, I need to do more research why it's not taking my label in the import profile. It has this sort of like misspelled linking parameter one. I'm not entirely sure why that's happening, but I need to do more research into that. And I'll let you know if I find out why it's loading that way. But when we look at the details of this record, the title, the creator, the publisher, creation date, format, all of that was pulled from the standard Dublin Core fields in the record. And so we didn't need to do any mapping. They're already mapped to these details fields. And I mean, basically they look right to me. So you'd want to make sure that, it's being mapped correctly. But This looks fine to me. And then our source is DC test. So that all looks right. We could take a look at the source record, and then we can actually take a look at the Dublin core that was loaded. So if you wanted to take a look at what the record is versus what you're seeing in Primo V, you could take a look at that. So the DC type also was just poster. So we used that normalization rule to map this DC type to images. And we actually see that the discovery resource type images was added to the Dublin core, that what came in as part of the normalization rule that we applied. So that all looks right, except for the way that the link is displaying here. So then, maybe you do one test and then you end up, changing the import profile type to load the rest, or, you could always just load them all and then take a look at them and make sure they look good. The good news is it's really easy to get rid of these if you do a test and they come into Primo V in an unexpected way and you want to change it. It's really easy to get rid of these records and then make adjustments and load them again. So I do want to show how we can view these records in Primo V in terms of scoping. So I just took the MMS ID and searched for it in Primo V. We also know because these records are external, if I took this MMS ID and tried to search for it in Alma, it would say, we don't have this, like nothing comes back. Because again, this is only external, so we can use this as an identifier in Primo V, and I think it does show in the URL. Yeah, so well, go into the full record. So it does use the MMS ID in the URL, but again, it doesn't exist in Alma. So that's kind of the difference there. But if we wanted to, maybe you have like a test view and you wanted to take a look, maybe you loaded your entire OAI repository and there's a lot of records in there and you want to see them kind of all together in Primo V to make sure that they came in okay. So we can do some scoping so that you can add this into a search profile slot and then take a look at them. So if we go into our discovery menu, search configuration, search profiles here. So I'm going to make actually a custom local data scope. Oh, and ignore these. I'm gonna recreate them. Okay, so if I add a custom local data scope, maybe I call it DC records, and then I'm going to add my condition here. You have the inventory option, external data source. So when you choose inventory external data source in your custom local data scoping, you can choose the repository. So maybe you have multiple repositories that you've added. You could add different conditions to bring all of your external repositories, or at least up to 3, in the same custom scope. So in this case, I'm just going to bring in the DC repository that I added. So I'm going to save this custom local data scope. And then I'm going to add a search profile to contain it. And in this case, I mean, you might end up wanting to add your custom local data scope in with some other search profile, like the everything scope or your local record scope, to get it, to display alongside the other bib records that you have in Alma. And maybe that's the intention. But you can also, of course, define it so that they are searched separately, which might be also a useful idea when you're just testing to see that they came in okay. So again, you might want to define this in a test scope. Choose my DC records custom local data scope. So I'm just going to create a scope, or search profile rather, that contains the repository that we just added. And then to be able to use it, of course, I have to go into my view, go into my main view, and I'm going to go under search profile slots, and I'm going to add a slot, in this case, to search only the repository that I made. And so I'm going to choose the search profile that I just defined, DC records, save it. And then I should see it in Primo V. Get rid of this. So I have my DC search profile here. And then there was a question also last week, and I think others have asked, It seems like for non-blended scopes, if you want to see everything, try using question. That seems to select everything. Like if I do, for example, in the articles scope, I get pretty much like 111 million records here. So it does seem to work like the wildcard asterisk, which works in the blended scope. I'm not entirely sure why the scopes act differently, but it seems like dollar or not dollar, question mark works for this to pull back everything. So here's my one record, but this might be something that you do to view all of the records in Primo V. And then, if you wanted to add it to another search profile and add it to another search profile slot, then you can do it that way to be able to see these in Primo V. But that's pretty much the end to end. And then, let's say that you're doing a test or they didn't come in right, or, you're going to um, get rid of that repository or whatever the case may be, you can pretty easily get rid of these records in Primo V. So you would go to the admin area. So we're not in config, we're in the regular menu admin area, the manage jobs and sets, and you would go to run a job. And you can filter by type to discovery management. And it's going to show you your discovery jobs. And the one you want is delete external resources. And then you choose your data source. So what you defined as your data source when you were importing the records. In this case, we're using DC repository. That's what I loaded. And then our set size is 1, so that matches exactly the number of records that were loaded. So you just want to do like a sanity check for that. And then you would just submit it. And it would remove the external data source, and then you would expect to see those records being removed within, 15 minutes of running the job. So I feel like that makes it a little like less stress to do this, knowing that you can pretty easily get rid of them from your Primo V interface, and then change your scoping accordingly. Um, but that's actually it for the demo. So let me see if there are questions. The last question I see here is, can you show us again how to view all imported external data? Yes, let's do that one more time. So we're going to go into config. So what I did, or I guess my method, was to create a search profile that specifically is searching the external data and put it in its own search profile slot so that I could view them separately, which might be a useful thing when you've just loaded them and you don't know what they look like. So what I did was I created a custom local data scope. Let's view it. Where external data source, our inventory equals external data source, and then you choose your DC repository here. So you're creating that custom local data scope, and then you would put your custom local data scope in a search profile. So I defined DC records and chose my custom local data scope, then added it to my view. So I created its own drop down, and then I used the question mark to search for everything in this scope. And there's only one record here. So that's what came back. And it might actually be gone now because I ran the delete job. Let's see. No, it's still there. So it's still kind of processing that delete. Let's see. Um, So someone has put in the chat some gotchas they've found doing imports. Um, One, you need to clear the harvest state when importing records in order to have the revised norm rules applied to all records. Yes, if you're using the OAI type, and I'm going to put this question, paste it into the chat so everybody can see it. Um, if you are using the OAI type, uh, import profile, there is the harvest date, and you may need to change that if you need to rerun the rule, rerun the job over again, sort of like unique to that profile type. But yes, and also maybe also to apply any revised norm rules. And I have been unable to edit the norm process to change the normalization rules. I find I needed to delete the process and create a new process with the changed rules. Yeah, thanks. That's really good tips. I hadn't heard that, but I could see that being kind of a sticky thing. So that's some really good tips there. There's a question, how does imported external data match and merge with previously imported data for the same source? Previously imported data for the same source. So in this case, would it be like a duplication within the repository, import repository itself, or we're expecting that it would match some bib record in the repository, in Alma rather? I'm not sure of the scenario. Um, There's a question if I'll demo OAI. Unfortunately, I can't because I just don't have an example repository that I can use. Um, yeah, I just don't have access to that to be able to do that and demo that, unfortunately. There's a question, what's the best solution when you want to load data from another Alma institution? Loading external data through OAI or using the Primo V deep search? That's an interesting question. Milan, I don't know if you have any opinion on it. I guess it depends if it's in another institution's Alma, you might need to use Primo V deep search. I'm not sure how the OAI repositories are set up, but if you're not able to use that base URL and have that information, if that's not part of the way that the data is set up, then you might need to use the Primo V deep search in that case. There's a question. We ran into the issue you noted with the malformed link last week. It only worked for us when we chose DC identifier rather than DC terms identifier. Ah, thank you. Let me paste this into the chat as well so you have it. So in this case, they're talking about, let me just go back to the, so we know that we had that weird linking, malformed linking parameter. It didn't take my label from my, where am I going? Into my import profile. In my discovery in the actual record itself. So into here. So they're saying instead of choosing DC terms identifier to choose DC identifier as the source tag here, and that will fix the linking issue. So thank you very much for that. There's a question, for example, oh, okay, so this is following up on the match and merge. Um, for example, an item in DSpace has been updated in DSpace and now has a different title and additional subject headings. Next time the external data is imported, will the record in Primo with the original title be matched and changed? If so, what is the match point, and is the data merged or replaced? That's a very good question. I would think that any updates would be processed, but I guess I don't know what the identifier is for that. I'd have to take a look at the doc, unless Milan, unless you know offhand. I assume it wouldn't load a duplicate, but I guess I don't know that 100%.
No, I mean, it should match based on the, as long as it's the same import profile that's loading the record, it should match on just the MMSID. So,
Oh, okay.
or not MMS, the, what is it called? Let me, sure. It takes part of the, to create the actual, like, um, record ID, it takes part of the, what's in the DC identifier field, but let me check. I know that's documented somewhere.
Oh, you know what? I think the job shows it. It shows the source
Mhm.
ID.
Yeah, so here in the documentation, we have a note where it says, because the import assigns a unique MMS ID to each record based on the specified identifier, subsequent imports of the same record updates the existing record. It does not create a new record. So it should, like the actual MMS ID will remain. So it shouldn't create a duplicate. It should just update the existing record.
Right, so it looks like it's taking the originating system ID from the DC identifier and it's using the URL in this case because I guess that's what I'm using for linking.
Mhm.
So I assume it's using this also for matching purposes. Um, okay, I don't see any other questions in chat. This is a little bit of a shorter session, but please feel free to ask anything if you have any other questions. If there's anything up closer towards the top of the chat that I didn't get to, I'll post it in the chat doc. Okay, there's another question. Let me post it for everybody to read. So thank you. Similar question in terms of maintenance of the imported data. What happens when an item is deleted in DSpace? Does it automatically get deleted in Primo, or does something have to be done manually? Um, that's also an interesting question. So if there was nothing that matched, I don't know if it would delete them. I'm not sure. I'll need to look that up. I'm not entirely sure.
So it should delete the record. So if it's not in the harvest, it's not in, so when the OEI request is sent, if it's not there, like when it runs when input profile runs, if it's not able to find that record, it's going to delete it from the uh, database and remove it from Primo V.
Thank you. So we'll wait just one more minute, see if anybody else has a question that they pop in. So there's a chat that there's a reload and delete option that allows you to reload existing data. Oops. Reload existing data and retain the permalinks for each existing record. This option will remove any records that are not included in the harvest or import profiles. Thank you. And there's a pointer to the documentation, so let me put that in the chat for you also. And all of this will be included in the chat doc.
So on this point, I want to clarify that. So the pipe that runs, on a regular schedule, not pipe, I'm sorry, the profile that runs, it's not any record that's deleted in DSpace won't be automatically deleted. It's only when you run that reload and delete. So you basically have to reharvest the entire um, repository again because it's only going to harvest based on from the last date. So whatever the harvest date was. Uh, so if any changes were made or if any records that are in the repository that have a timestamp before this, like let's say it's deleted and it has a timestamp before that date, it won't be deleted. So you have to do the entire reload. You have to run the reload and delete basically to ensure that the records are moved.
That makes sense. There's a question also, what user roles are needed for these normalization rules and various profile tasks? You'll need the discovery admin role, obviously, to get into that menu. And then you likely need like a repository role to be in the metadata editor to do that task. There's a question, if I need to change the Lincoln parameter, do I need to reload everything? Um, yeah, I would think so. If you're making changes to the import profile, I would think you would need to run it again. We'll see if there's any other questions. Okay, I don't see anything coming in. Um, but if you type something right as I'm closing out, it will come into the meeting chat notes and I'll answer it in the chat. And thank you so much, Balan, for answering the questions that I couldn't answer live. And I'll put all of this into the doc so that you can read it. And just a reminder also that where the recordings live, there's also the YouTube recordings. Those have closed captioning on them. So if that's useful to you, take a look at that one instead. And thanks, everybody. And we'll see you maybe next week for the Ferber and dedupe session. So have a great day. Thank you.